All right, as you can see on the handout, we're looking at Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 tonight. Started last week, and of course, just kind of briefly talked about the theme of the book. And if you remember in that, basically the whole theme of the book has to do with how the law of Christ is better than the law of Moses. And the reason that was important is because the Hebrew Christians, of course, had already obeyed the gospel, but they were wanting to go back and starting to fall back and go back to the system of the law of Moses. And so the writer here is encouraging them by pointing out basically they're giving up a superior system for an inferior one. And so that's kind of the theme that you'll find throughout the entire book. Question number one, it deals with the idea of the theme of the book, though, on our handout here. Why do you think some people follow Christ for a little while and then turn away? I'm sure there's a number of reasons why that is. What would you say is some of the most predominant reasons that people do that?
Because of discipleship.
Yeah, that was the first thing I wrote down. I think sometimes as Christians, we just don't understand, what it costs to go to heaven. It's not a free road, right? It's not an easy road. There are sacrifices that have to be made. There are prices that have to be paid in order to do that. And I think a lot of times, people think whenever you do right, everything should be easy. I don't know why that's human thinking, but it is. Generally, when things are going wrong in people's lives, they're thinking, well, I'm not doing what's right. If I do what's right, then everything should go smoothly. Everything will be okay. But that's not generally the case. Generally, the Bible teaches us that when we do what's right, it's going to be a difficult road, isn't it? And so, I think a lot of people probably think, the Christian life should be an easy life. It should be a pleasurable life. And maybe that's what these people thought. I mean, maybe when they obeyed the gospel, they thought, well, this will be a breeze. This is a lot easier than the law of Moses, but maybe they found out it wasn't quite as easy as what we thought it'd be. We like the law of Moses a little bit better. What else? What are some other reasons?
Some people feel inadequate. Some people feel inadequate. They don't feel like they're perfect, so therefore they quit.
Yeah, sometimes people get the feeling, well, we can't be good enough. There's no way we could ever make it. And of course, none of us are going to make it to heaven on our own merit or worth. If that were the case, none of us would go there. But we do have to try, though, don't we? And certainly another teaching of Scripture. I think when we think about the reward of Christianity, the work comes in this life, doesn't it? The effort comes in this life, and the reward comes after. And a lot of times, maybe it's a society that we live in, but we look for instant gratification. It's almost like you want the reward before you put in the work. And heaven is something that again you got to put some effort into if we're going to get there, and have to put the work in. And I think that's really what these next couple of chapters are more about. He's going to talk about the idea of Jesus being better than Moses. He's going to talk about there is a better rest than what men received under the law of Moses. And of course, that's for us today. So let's go over to chapter 3, Hebrews chapter 3. And we're not going to read all these verses here, but let's give it a good stab to start with. And somebody read the first 6 verses here. Hebrews 3, 1 through 6 for us.
Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him that appointed him also, as also Moses was faithful to all his house. For this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as much who hath builded the house hath more honor than the house.
Okay, if you remember the first couple of chapters we talked about, studied last week, deals with the idea of Jesus is better than the angels. And basically, there was a contrast that was made between angels and Jesus. And that's kind of what we're getting into here with Moses. Why would the Hebrew writer compare Christ to Moses?
The faithfulness.
Okay, yeah, that's the similarities between them. But why would he make the comparison between Jesus and Moses?
Because they were wanting to go back to the law of Moses.
Yeah, basically, again, remember the idea is, last week we talked about the old law was given by the hands of angels, wasn't it? The new law was given by the hands of the Son of God. That's a lot better law, a lot better person gave that law. And so chapter 3 begins with the idea, Moses gave the Old Testament, Jesus gave the New Testament. Well, Jesus is greater than Moses. And so he starts by a comparison, and question number 2 here on your handout, asking what ways are Moses and Jesus similar? And Danny really hit the main idea here. The main idea was they were both faithful. You know, I always talk about this idea. You know, we don't always all have to do the same thing, but we do all have to be faithful, don't we? Moses was faithful in the work that God gave him to do. Jesus was faithful in the work that God gave him to do. But there were more similarities between Moses and Jesus than just faithfulness. In fact, remember, we look in the Old Testament, we have these types and these shadows, and I think the Bible certainly teaches that Moses was a type or a shadow of Jesus. And you remember in Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 18, God is speaking here to Moses, and he says, I will raise up for them, that's talking about for Israel, a prophet like unto you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it's interesting, he's talking about Jesus there, of course, but it's interesting in verse 18, he said this prophet that he raises up is going to be like Moses. So what are some similarities between Jesus and Moses?
Leader of the people.
Okay.
Messenger from God.
Okay, let's start with the idea of the leader. Moses led God's people to freedom, didn't he? Led them out of Egyptian bondage. Jesus leads us to freedom today, leads us out of the bondage of sin. What's another similarity between Moses and Jesus?
The reluctance sometimes of the people that they were to be leaders over was fallen by the wayside and always complaining and not wanting to do what was the Word of God had told them.
Yeah, I would say that'd be certainly the people. I don't think we as people probably ever change very much, do we? But Moses had difficulties in getting the people to listen to him. Of course, like Danny said, not everybody listens to Jesus today. What are some other ways?
With Moses' one spike of pride that he paid dearly for, their humility.
Okay.
Both of them put people before themselves.
Yeah.
Christ gave his life, Moses gave his life in service to them.
Yeah, when you look at Moses, you know, one of the things we emphasized when we went through the Old Testament study of Moses was, you know, he was a person who genuinely cared for the people. He was willing, remember, he was willing to get his own name marked out of the book of life in order to let them have life. And I don't know, how many people would you do that for today? But it just shows how much he really did care for him. Were they both lawgivers? Yeah, Moses was responsible for giving God's law to the people in the Old Testament. Jesus is responsible for giving God's people or God's law to the people today. What about the way that God communicated with Moses? Yeah, he spoke to him directly. And remember, that was unique, wasn't it? God didn't communicate or hadn't communicated with a prophet like that before. And think about how God communicated to his son while he was here upon this earth. And so, you know, there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of ways that Jesus and Moses were alike. But in the eyes of the Jews, I don't think you could have got a name in their mind that was higher than Moses. You know, Moses was kind of superior to everybody. And so the Hebrew writer is showing, yeah, Jesus and Moses, they're alike, you know, in a lot of different ways. And they were both faithful in what God gave them to do. But the point that he's really driving at here is Christ is superior to Moses, even though there are a lot of similarities to them. And so question number 3 is the question, why is Jesus worthy of more honor than Moses? What does he say there in verses 5 and 6?
He's the only begotten Son of God. It's his house to start with.
Okay. What was Moses in the house of God? He was a servant. Okay, so think about the idea. A lot of times in the King James Version, when you read the word house, well, I say a lot of times, some of the times it refers to the idea of family. That's what it means. Household is the idea. So what was a servant in a family? Is that as high as you could get? No. Servant wasn't much, was it? So here you have Moses, and Moses was just a servant in the house of God. But what's Jesus? Verse 6. Jesus is the son. So which one would have more authority in a family, the servant or the son of the family? Well, naturally, the son, right? And so the point that he's making here is, you know, Moses was just a servant in this family. Jesus is over the family. You know, he's the one in charge of the house or the family. And it's also interesting to go back up to verse 4. He talks about every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. Remember back in chapter 1, he'd already pointed out that Christ made everything. Now, it didn't matter if it was things in heaven or things upon this earth. And so here is Moses. He was just part of this family. Christ actually built the church, didn't he? He actually built this family of God. And so we understand by implication that Jesus would have been greater than Moses. Let's go down. Somebody read verses 7 and 8 for us here in chapter 3.
Wherefore, as the Holy Ghost said, today, if you'll hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation in the day of temptation in the wilderness.
Okay, so he's making this point, and it's kind of a, I don't know, to me when I read it, it's kind of an awkward shift here, because it's kind of like, well, it's kind of like Dennis talks about chasing rabbits. That's a little bit like what it is here, because he brings up this idea in verse 6. You know, we're the house of God if we remain faithful. And then he brings up, you know, this idea of God's family in the Old Testament, and how God's family failed to enter into this rest. And he points out in verses 7 and 8, you know, not to be like them, not to be have the same attitude and the same heart that they had. And so, question number 4: what warning is repeated here? And it's repeated because it's mentioned in the book of Psalms and, of course, in the Old Testament several times. But what warning is repeated here by the author of Hebrews? What's the warning we have?
Harden your heart.
Yeah. There's really a couple of things. The first thing that he says is what?
Hear his voice.
Yeah, hear the voice of God, right? And the second thing, like Dennis pointed out, is don't harden your hearts like Israel did in the rebellion. Remember whenever that God told them to go in and to take the promised land, they said, we can't do it. You know, we can't defeat the people. We're not going to win this. We're not going to be able to take the land. And so they rebelled against God. So the warning is to hear God's voice when? Today, right? Don't wait till tomorrow. Don't wait a year from now. Listen to the voice of God today, and don't harden our hearts. You know, don't disbelieve God. Don't have the unbelief exemplify the same unbelief that the children of Israel did in the Old Testament. So it brings up the idea: how long do we have to obey God? Adam, how long do you have to obey God?
I got it right now.
Okay. we don't really know, do we? I mean, the only thing that we know is we have right here and we have right now, don't we? Well, somebody said, well, I'll wait till tomorrow. Are we guaranteed tomorrow? No, it's not a guarantee. And so we all know, we know that we have a limited period of time to obey God, don't we? I mean, we don't have forever and ever. We aren't guaranteed tomorrow. And so the only way to ensure that we do what God says is to do it today. Do it right now. That's the only guarantee, the only time that we have. And so, remember Israel, God told them to go take the promised land. They said, no, we're not going to do it. They disobeyed, but what'd they say later?
My bad, let's go.
Yeah, they said, okay. After God said, well, you're going to wander in the wilderness, they said, no, we'll go take the land now. But it was too late, wasn't it? The time to obey God had run out. And so we're limited in time. And so the encouragement, the warning for us is listen to the voice of God today. Don't let our hearts become hard like Israel did in the Great Rebellion. Let's go down. Somebody read, let's do verses 12 and 13 here. Still in chapter 3.
Take heed, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through your deceitfulness of sin.
Okay, so he talks about this idea how Israel disobeyed God when they came up out of the land of Egypt. So question number 5 is what command are given here to these Jewish Christians of the first century?
He's using it as a warning as the flip side of saying, remain faithful. He's saying, don't harden your hearts, remain faithful, believe me.
Yeah, and so the first word, there is beware. What does that mean? When you see a sign that says beware of dog, what does that mean?
Could be trouble.
Does that mean you should just do what? No, don't pet him. Yeah. But it means be alert, right? Be on the lookout. Be watchful. Be mindful. Because danger could lie ahead. And so the idea that he starts with is, of course, the idea to be alert, to stay alert, and be on the lookout. And what are we supposed to be on the lookout for?
Lie, sin.
Yeah, Satan, right? And the sin that he tempts us with, and ultimately, why do we disobey God? Why did Israel disobey God?
Faith.
It was a lack of faith, was it? Did they believe that what God said would happen if they did what he said? No, they said this isn't going to work, right? We can't defeat these guys. We can't overcome these defenses. And so ultimately they didn't believe that God would do what he said he would do. And that's what we're supposed to be alert about, watch out for. There's a lot of things we read about in the scripture that God says he will do. I think sometimes we have to be careful that we don't just kind of push those off and in our own minds think, God won't really do that. Or God won't really require this of me or that of me. What's that called? When God says he'll do something and we don't believe he'll do it. It's unbelief. It's a lack of faith or a lack of trust in God. And so that's what we're supposed to be on the lookout for, based upon that example of Old Testament Israel. So number 6, what can we do to avoid hardening our hearts toward God? What are some things we can do? What are the obvious? There's some pretty obvious ones. Yeah, listen, right? The idea of listen to the voice of God today, right? Don't wait until tomorrow, but start listening right now. What else would you say?
Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. Read the Bible.
Okay. Yeah, read and study God's word. Soak that up. Take it to the bank, right? Take it as truth. Put it into practice in our lives. I was thinking about some of the things that Israel did in the Old Testament, just kind of thinking back. through some of their history. And a lot of their problems, whenever you read about things that happened to them, a lot of it started with griping and complaining, didn't it? You ever notice that? They start griping and complaining about what they didn't have or how good they used to have it, or, one person was doing too much or taking too much authority. But it starts with not being content. And I think we have to be careful about that, because we can't find contentment in being the children of God and having heaven waiting for us, then certainly open the door for sin. A lot of times they forgot. They just willingly or otherwise, they just forgot about God, forgot about what He had done for them. What were some of the other things? Well, delay was one. We talked about that, right? They weren't going to do what God said, but then they decided, well, we will later. How'd that work? Did. And so, there's a lot of things, but again, I go back to the idea that we started with tonight. And I think it's only natural as humans, we want to do what's most comfortable for us to do. Would you agree with that? Does everybody like to get out of your comfort zone? No. No, and the older I get, the less I like it. But, we want to do whatever is the most comfortable for us to do. I think it's only natural. We want quick fixes to things that happen to us or things that we encounter in this life. And we want to do what's most convenient. And you look back at Israel, and that was a lot of the problems that they encountered was because of those things. So there's a number of things that we can do to keep from hardening our hearts. But certainly the best formula is to listen to God and to listen right now. Don't delay in doing what God has told us to do. Verse 12 here, in question number 7, how are those described who turned away from the living God? How does the Hebrew writer describe them there in verse 12? What kind of heart did they have?
Evil.
An evil heart. Why would he call them, or why would he say they had an evil heart? What are some of the characteristics of an evil heart?
Unbelief.
Yeah. Does an evil-hearted person believe God? Does an evil-hearted person rebel against God? Yeah. Does an evil-hearted person follow God? No. That's what these people were. They had an evil heart. And so we don't often think of Israel that way, but that's what many of them, or at least inwardly, that's what they were. So question number 8, what's the connection between sin and unbelief?
Unbelief would be sin.
Okay. And unbelief is what? How would you define unbelief?
No faith.
Yeah, no faith in God, a failure to trust, to obey God, and so obviously that would lead to sin. And you think about Israel, the example that's put down here. Obviously, it's talking about this idea. God told them the truth, didn't He? He told them if they would go and fight these people, that He would fight for them, and they would conquer all this and inherit the land. Was that true? Yeah. So what happens when we fail to believe the truth?
We're sending a message of unbelief.
Yeah, if you don't believe the truth, what do you go believe? A lie. I mean, there's only two things. You either believe the truth or you don't. If you don't believe the truth, then what you believe is a lie. And so Israel, you think about how unbelief is and sin are connected. When we reject the truth, then we're opening ourselves up to believe a lie, aren't we?
I think that's one of the greatest cons today, specifically in our country, that there is no absolute. There's no absolute right wrong, there is no absolute truth, and that's what they're trying to sell us every day of the week. There is no absolute.
Yeah.
It's all good, whatever you want to do, there's no real right and wrong. That's baloney.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of, well, we could get into a pretty good discussion along those lines, but if there is no absolute, then, there's chaos. there has to be right and wrong, there has to be lines, there has to be absolutes. But the bottom line is, when we fail to believe what God says, we're opening ourselves up to believe error, aren't we? We're opening ourselves up to believe a lie. And that's what the children of Israel did. So what happened to that generation? Somebody read verses 17 and 18 here in chapter 3.
But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not?
Okay, so what happened to that generation that rebelled against God?
They got turned into carcasses.
Yeah, what happened to their bodies? They died. Where'd they die? You ever think about that? How many people did they bury in the wilderness over those 40 years? You know, and you know, to have your body buried in a place in that day and age separate from your ancestors was considered a dishonor. You know, numerous millions were buried out there in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of nowhere. But the worst thing was what? That was bad enough in and of itself, but
They couldn't enter into eternal rest.
yeah, they didn't get to enter into the rest that God had prepared for Israel, and of course that rest involved the land of Canaan, didn't it? And basically, he's going to ring the bell on us here. We've got like 4 minutes left. Okay, he's going to give me 4 minutes. What a pal. Basically, chapter 4 is about this idea of how much better rest we have promised to us than the children of Israel had promised to them under the law of Moses. Their rest was what? The land of Canaan. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this idea, and maybe we'll just do that since we got like, I don't know, 7 more questions here. What do you think of when you think of rest? Okay, relief. You know, over the years, it seems like it's developed in our minds, for whatever reason, that, you know, when we get to heaven, we're just going to be sitting around, you know, fishing in a pond or you know, just basically inactive, laying around doing absolutely nothing. When the children of Israel got into the land of Canaan and rested, did they have to do anything?
Sure.
Did it mean the work was over? What was the rest?
There was peace.
Yeah, there were certain things that they got relief from, wasn't there? The Hebrew writer in chapter 4 uses the idea of God resting in creation. Does that mean God's never done another thing since he quit creating? Well, no, it's not that he quit doing everything, but when it came to creation, he was done. It was over with. And the Bible paints to us this idea of rest, and basically, you know, it's the idea of all these worldly and earthly things that we have to deal with. You know, trials, no more. Temptation, no more. Sickness, disease, no more. Death, no more. We get rest. We don't have to worry about those things anymore. Does it mean we're going to be sitting up in heaven on a cloud, just floating around doing nothing all the time? No. But we do get rest from certain things in this life that weigh upon us. And I think about the statement of Jesus on the cross in John 19. He said, "It is finished." You think that was a relief for Christ? Think he was glad when all that was done with and over with? It was finished. It was over. He got to rest from all that? I would think so. And so it paints to us this idea of rest. And again, sometimes we think it means complete ceasing of activity. But when you look at the land of Canaan, you look at the shadow, you look at the idea of God, it was relief. He was done with certain things, but that didn't mean that you never do anything else. But the rest that we have promised is a lot better rest than what Israel experienced in the land of Canaan.
I think to me, it seems like that heaven will be working with purpose.
Yes. And working with joy. You know, that's something that's kind of hard for us to fathom, because generally when we work, man, we get tired, we get hot. I mean, it's uncomfortable. But when you don't have to worry about those things anymore, you realize how much more enjoyable work's going to be. I mean, it's going to be great. You can do anything and never get tired, never get mentally wore out, never get physically worn out. You know, don't have to worry about those things anymore. So there's a great rest that we're going to experience. But again, it's not the idea of just completely ceasing any activity, you know, just floating around doing nothing all day. And I know there's not days in heaven, but you get the idea or the concept. Okay, so that's about all the time we have for tonight. Hopefully you get the picture of how much better heaven is going to be than the rest that Israel in the Old Testament experienced. But that's really the point that the Hebrew writer is trying to make. You're exchanging a superior rest. You're giving up a superior rest for a promise of rest in the Old Testament that is much inferior. So, anybody got any thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
I got one that on the deal about today. A few years ago, a good friend of mine was diagnosed with cancer, and the things we heard, well, it's, you know, didn't sound positive. And when talking with him, I didn't know exactly how to broach that particular deal, and I asked him what his prognosis was, and he said the same as yours. I just know what's going to kill me, and I never thought for. I mean, that'll always take it. He's right. You're one of them. Death thing.
Yep, we're all going the same way for sure. All right, anybody else?